And you're just going to make some comments around spoke wastewater treatment plants, which we have, during our hearings and submission process, did hear a wee bit about from submitters and offering to provide some of those.
So just some brief statements. I guess the first thing is, in my opinion, decentralised wastewater treatment plants and systems, they have a role in servicing communities. But in my opinion, that role doesn't extend to on the doorstep of a city. So if you're in Pupu, Kapai, decentralised wastewater treatment plant makes sense. But when you're 100 metres away from a reticulated city, it doesn't make sense. I can certainly understand why developers are wanting to utilise decentralised package systems, because it enables them to get away before the capacity issues that I spoke of earlier are addressed, and they are significant issues that will come at significant cost to address. Decentralised systems also present a significant risk can present a significant risk to the communities that they serve if the operations and maintenance and design isn't completed appropriately. And that's one of the, I guess, the challenges from a local authority perspective is sometimes these systems go in with good intentions. The designs might not be to a standard that a local authority would require. There might be an ownership structure established to be responsible for the ongoing operation and maintenance of those systems. But sometimes, and we've got experience in the city and in the metro area, those systems fail. And when those public health issues emerge, it's often the local authority's door who's knocked on to come and help. In communities that we haven't, funded infrastructure for. So there's just a whole lot of risk associated with poorly designed, operated and maintained on-site wastewater treatment systems. But in saying that, like I said, like I opened with, they do have a place in servicing our communities across the country. We did consider them as part of the metro area detailed business case, whether they should be employed for those smaller communities. And that particular option was not identified on the shortlist, let alone the preferred option for long-term servicing of the metro area. I think it's also missed opportunity if there's capital invested in those types of facilities to achieve those longer term investment objectives that we collectively agreed to, including maximising efficient use of resource recovery, those types of things, and enabling sustainable growth and making provision for growth within the metro area. Because those on-site systems, they are for their own needs only. Some of the timeframes that are driving the Southern Wastewater Treatment Plant are in part to avoid the airport going down that road. They already have an on-site wastewater treatment plant. At the moment, they are discharging into tanks, which are trucked away to a municipal system. We would not like to see them invest in more short-term on-site treatment plants. They add an operation and maintenance workload and cost that people often underestimate. So yeah, just wanted to make those statements while I was here.
No, thanks, Jackie. Any questions of Jackie around that? It appear to be, so no, thank you. So next on my list, I think, Bill, next up on transport.
Everyone's favourite subject. So a bit like Jackie, I'm going to give a bit of context to the work that's been done over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, but it probably won't be as long or as good. But I've got a few slides just to go through. Really the work since 2018, where I think for the first time, future-proof, started thinking land use and transport in the same sort of spatial planning context. That work predated me, but certainly informed the work that myself and particularly the Transport Working Group, so that's the group similar to the PPWG that Miffy leads, but for transport people like me, from all the organisations represented here, including Mark over there, who can chip in and help me if I miss anything out. So where we started off, and I know the terminology has changed since then, but we were tasked back in 2018, 2019 to come up with a way forward, if you like, that really tried to counter or develop a programme around what we termed back then as a radical transport shift. Something that we could programme that we could develop that covered all modes and was related to land use. And that was basically the formulation of the spatial plan transport programme business case.
That makes sense.
Which fell out of that work and really commenced in 2020 and ended up in 2022 as the programme business case that we refer to so much today. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Yes. So next slide, please, Lyndall. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is related to the transport programme business case, not other wider transport issues not related to the programme development itself. So in a nutshell, I realise that lots of you are very familiar with this work already, but the programme business case was really there to be our transport land use integrated piece. It was there to answer some specific questions around can the Hamilton Waikato sub-region, just like our colleagues in Tauranga and Wellington and Auckland, can it actually sustain a rapid transit system? And if it could, what mode would that be? And the answer came back very much, yes, we can, if we do the right land use conditions. It certainly won't be something that we can do overnight. We're talking a 30 to 50 year programme to get that rapid transit future. And the mode that we came back was very much around bus. So I think a very fit for purpose, very cleverly scaled piece of work, probably a lot better than a lot of our colleagues around the country in terms of an actual realistic programme. So that work also gave us some guidance around timing, priorities of routes, because we did come up with various alignments that I can go up in a minute. It talked about how supporting networks of walking and cycling needed to be developed to help us build our patronage. And it really brought into a programme format a lot of our business as usual work. So the public transport planning that the regional council does and the infrastructure provision that councils like Waipa and WDC and Hamilton do. And obviously it brought in that big land use context. There was a very strong land use scenario and interface with the transport networks that you see and the land use plans that we had at the time, which are very similar to the land use plans that we have now. It was very much represented in that piece of work. Again, the slide you're seeing up top now was actually a couple of years old, but the reason I sort of recycled it because it did talk about in the last bullet, consider the long-term land use outcomes identified by Future Proof. So kind of alluding to the point that Robert made earlier, there is some flexibility and agility in the programme that we've developed to respond to land use changes. Talk a little bit about that more in a minute. Next slide, please, Lyndall. Just a little bit about, Jackie talked about objectives around the business case work in the water space. We had our own in the transport space as well. And in summary, they had a very strong safety focus. We had a very strong freight and productivity, efficient movement focus, which is obviously still very strong today. We had a sort of a choice focus. We wanted to develop a multimodal network supported by this long-term rapid transit network. And we had a very strong land use settlement pattern focus. We wanted a line along corridors. We wanted to support a compact urban form, which was very consistent, Hamilton urban growth strategy and the Future Proof strategy at the time. Back in the day when we were allowed to be positive around emissions, we had a very strong emissions focus and a very strong equity focus. And that was basically the key benefits that we tried to achieve in that 2022 programme business case. Next slide, please, Lyndall. So I've got a couple of slides here that, again, just to try and focus on that land use, because it often got overlooked, I think, in a programme business case. And I think one of the actual strengths of our work back then was the fact that we did really align our transport network development and staging with areas where we could actually get some intensification benefits, and in particular where we already had the existing growth planned, particularly in the Hamilton context. That was the existing greenfields, and certainly the stage 1 city centre. So the point that Mark was alluding to earlier today, I think very consistent with this. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide, please, Lyndall. So just to go into a little bit more detail around the land use there. Programme business case did test a number of scenarios around land use. And without going into detail on the ones that we didn't choose, they did really have a much more dispersed pattern. And it was sort of inconsistent with the compact approach that we were looking at back in 2022 and very much looking at now in areas. And again, with that strong city centre focus. So essentially the land use outcome that we adopted as part of the programme business case did support existing greenfield, but had a very much, I think it was a 70% more brownfield focus, if you like. We'll go to the next slide, please, Lyndall. So I'm jumping ahead here. So after a 2,000-page programme business case that lasted about 18 months to develop, with I think 26 supporting appendices, we did end up with a concept rapid transit network. And you can see the 2022 iteration of that work on your slide there. Now that's one of the development of that concept is one of the 4 pieces of work that we've carried on since 2022, which I'll be reporting on Friday as part of the Future Proof PT subcommittee. So essentially there, I think the takeaway from our long-term focus on robust rapid transit is that that is our end game. That is aligned to where we currently see growth. The work we've done up till now has been developing that as a concept and looking at the staging and timing of that network related to current land use conditions. So I think, again, the point Robert, I think, was making earlier was that if this is a network based on where we think we can get the best benefits, if those benefits related to emissions, compact city, journey times, choice. And our focus really, the one that stood out was the yellow route going north. But if things were to change, I guess the work we've done to date has got some flexibility to, I guess, adapt to any land use changes that may come in the future. And I guess looking at that slide as well, that's a 20 or 30-year vision at best. You know, we can do some of these things quite early because we can identify where we think we can get the demand and patronage. But the work that I think the regional council and councils do in the meantime, as well, business as usual, is fundamental to achieving that future aspiration. And that goes for transport and for land use as well. So just quickly looking at the final slide, it's really, really hard to put a programme together for a 30-year programme, which is ever changing, particularly when obviously we have funding challenges and a lot of our projects that support our programmes can't be funded when we thought they might be, and that's just life. But we do have a broad programme up here that does focus that BRT concept on that sort of 10, 15 to 30-year period. So I'll probably leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Phil. Any questions at this point? You have a transport one.
Ironically, no.
Okay. Questions? Thanks very much, Phil. And we'll now move to the Southern Links form and function. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. So just to put into context why we're looking at this, there've been a number of submissions that relate to land on the southern edge of Hamilton and around the airport. So what we wanted to do today is just help update you on some work that's been happening looking at the form and function of Southern Links. So in terms of the broader background, Southern Links it has a long history dating back to the 1960s. It's originally being conceived as part of the Auckland to Hamilton motorway, and with the current designation being confirmed in 2016. Since then, there's been a number of changes to the wider context, and that includes things like the Waikato Expressway being constructed. And other things to note here is that the wider Southern Links network includes not only the state highway component, but city arterials, and indicated on the map that I think was also part of the briefing report that you've received. In thinking of that wider network, it's worth noting as well that work has commenced on the city arterials with the new bridge over the Waikato River and linking to Wairiri Drive, well under construction at the moment. Next slide, please, Lyndall. So the purpose of the review was this kicked off in 2023, and it was to look at the form and function of Southern Links in the light of the changes that have been occurring, both in terms of physical changes, as say the other roads and infrastructure that's being constructed, but also some of the policy context, and noting that there has been quite a passage of time, over 10 years since the notice of requirement was originally prepared. So it's appropriate just to keep checking in to make sure that the form and function is still fit for current purpose. So as part of that, we have been looking at the staging and sequencing issues for implementation, and also considering what the next steps for the project might be. And just to clarify that the form and function review has been focused on the state highway component, and that it is not a business case in itself, but it is information that will help inform decisions as we move forward. So next slide, please, Lyndall. So the findings from the review was that the designation was prepared at the time, assuming that it would be a limited access road without any direct connection to adjoining land. The use of the wider transport network has continued to evolve, and traffic volumes have grown with significant increases, particularly on State Highway 21, linking between State Highway 3 and the expressway around the airport. And there are localized issues and constraints on the network, including the pinch point on State Highway 21 at Narrows Bridge, and congestion on routes still through Hamilton, including State Highways 1C and 3. So next slide, please, Lyndall. So taking these into account and thinking of what does this mean for Southern Links, should its form and function just stay as it is, or consider evolving that? 4 recommendations came out of the study, and these relate to effectively 4 different spatial areas, again shown on the map. So area A, which is the eastern section between State Highway 3 and the expressway, it's proposed to advance a business case for that section. In section B, which is the West Hamilton area, again, it's proposed to develop a business case jointly between the City Council and Waka Kotahi to look at that Western Hamilton network and make sure that there's integrated approaches to how we manage the state highway and local roading networks. Recommendation C focuses on how we could optimise the existing networks and look at progressing the work that's already underway with the arterial network within the Peacocks area. And finally, recommendation D, which is quite pertinent in relation to submissions that we have today, is identifying that some additional work is needed between the future-proof partners to determine the long-term development strategy and transport approach in the northwest sector of Southern Links. So that's between Kahikatea Drive and State Highway 3, so around the SL1 area where there is a submission. So next slide, thanks Lyndall. And then just bringing things up to date, the government has issued a draft policy statement on land transport. This now includes Southern Links as a road of national significance, and there's an expectation that that will contribute to unlocking housing growth. And the State Highway investment proposal, the SHIP, now includes line items for Southern Links and the West Hamilton Network Review. So that hopefully just gives you a little bit more context and bring things up to date with where we're at with looking at Southern Links. Questions?
Okay, thanks, Mark. Any questions of Mark? Sarah, you look.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just a couple. Firstly, the funding identified for the West Hamilton Network Review, is that within, do you know the time frame for that?
It's I can check. I don't have it immediately to hand. So it's, as I say, just being included in the SHIP, which was announced a couple of weeks ago, I think.
Yeah, I think it'll show up in the CNLTP.
In the what?
Yeah,
Okay.
in this time, it is in this time period. Yeah.
Okay, and so there was a answer given from SR1 in terms of their ideal, I guess, outcome around the Southern Links corridor and its form and function. But it's a little bit different to what's been envisaged previously, where they're suggesting there's an arterial which goes through the residential area rather than skirting the edge for part of it, which is different to the current designation. So just interested in this kind of thinking, to what extent it's taken into account, or if there's any early thoughts on it.
Yeah, so there's, I think that's essentially what that recommendation D from the form and function review was suggesting, that more work needs to be done to understand. Firstly, if there is going to be growth in that area, what type of growth it might be, and what are the transport requirements of how does that link in with the land use. So quite a lot of work needs to be done there, not just simply about how you plug in new development to Southern Links, but looking at the wider networks and how traffic would flow around and how you can create the right context for linking with public transport and things that, objectives that Phil was describing in the MSP. So that's a piece of work we've still got to get into, unpicking the detail of that yet. We haven't got there. Obviously, the submitter has got their ideas as to what they'd like to see, and we're still looking to get the finalised version of the GPS. So that does make reference to, say, Southern Links and the housing growth element of it. But it also makes some suggestions that roads of national significance are 4-lane grade separated roads. So we're just seeking clarification in that final version of the GPS, and see how that can feed into doing that review and integrating with the land use there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, don't appear to be. Thanks very much, Mark. Now we'll move to Robert. You're doing PDA's implementation
I'm
plan
just
and
race
spatial
through
policy plans.
some specific issues that came up from submitters, which are reflected in our staff report to you in terms of recommended responses. So first off, priority development areas. On this slide, the third bullet point is actually the most important. So you had a bunch of submitters who said, we want to be a priority development area, pick us, pick us. PDAs there's a list of about 20 odd priority development areas, and then there's half a dozen focus areas. So the priority development areas are just all the areas that we've said we're going to put growth. That's all they are. And then we have our half dozen focus areas where we're actually concentrating on, because those are the areas where we as a partnership need to work collectively to get those areas underway. There are challenges that require multiple agencies around the table to work on them. So being ascribed PDA status doesn't actually give you any more status than being a future urban zone in the strategy, and being classified as a high priority PDA and therefore listed explicitly and reported on explicitly really just reflects that you're a really complicated one that's going to be difficult for us to get away, and that we recognize we need to work collectively on. So actually, in some ways, developers might not want to be on that list. So I suppose the key point is with PDAs, we prefer not to list them in the strategy, because then we're locked into those for 3 years. We want the flexibility to chop and change as things get complicated. If I could use an example, on that list, Peacocks could have qualified in South Hamilton as a PDA. It's complicated. It requires lots of effort from the partners working collaboratively. But we already had arrangements in place in terms of the housing infrastructure funding and financing agreement, which meant that it wasn't complicated. And so we didn't put it on the list as a super high area of focus PDA. But it could become complicated again. And so we want to be able to bring it back in if that were to happen. So that's PDAs, and why our advice is don't tie yourself to identifying particular areas as PDAs. Use the implementation plan as the way out of that. And that leads me to my next slide, which is, what is this implementation plan beast? So part of NPSUD requires every local authority to prepare an implementation plan. And it's a single document that applies to the whole of the future-proof area. In essence, it's our annual work program. It says these are the things we're going to do in the next 12 months or the next 3 years to implement the future development strategy. Fortunately, it's not part of the FDS, so we don't need to consult on it through a special consultative process. It's just part of our day-to-day work. It doesn't have the legal effect. It really is just guiding our actions. But it at least can give transparency to people about the things that we as Futureproof are going to do to advance implementation on the strategy. So if we'd had an FDS implementation plan that was that explicit when we adopted the strategy in 2022, we might have mentioned the emerging areas work as a key implementation plan activity. And that would have at least given people transparency that we were working on that topic, and we would expect to pick it up in the next couple of years. Next slide. So in adopting the draft strategy, we already breadcrumbed, if you like, some actions that we expect to turn up in the implementation plan, which are the kinds of things that FPIC are asking me questions about every time we get together. You know, what do we need to do in terms of RPS district plans and long-term plans to make sure everyone's aligned with the strategy, recognizing that there is more work to do in those emerging areas, but there's also more work to do in terms of what is our strategy for the North Waikato and its connections through to Auckland, and our strategy for the connections between Cambridge and Tauranga, Manamata-Piako district, the land use response that will inevitably, and pressure that will inevitably arise from building the Cambridge to Pierere Expressway section. Those kind of things are things that we need to do some work on. Said we do refinements to the monitoring and reporting framework, particularly around being better about tracking outcomes. And so you saw the housing affordability targets come into the strategy as one of the things we would monitor to help us determine if we need to do more work on a particular topic. we need other indicators for some of our other priority areas, which we're working on at the moment. And we recognised when we were adopting the strategy that there are a huge amount of pent-up demand, if you like, or development prospects around the retirement sector across the sub-region. We don't have a strategic response to how we deal with that demand. And so we said, let's kick the can down the road. There's some really complicated issues here. Don't think we're in a position to deal with them yet. We need to do some more research and some more working with the sector. The plan is that when we, depending on your resolutions from your deliberations, we would provide an updated list of things we expect to be included in the implementation plan alongside the recommendation to adopt the strategy to FPIC and to the partner councils. And then in September, we would bring an implementation plan to FPIC for endorsement, which would have my 3-year budget, work program, all that sort of stuff wrapped up in it as well. So that's how we're intending to use the implementation plan. Maybe pause there for questions, because I know it's kind of part of our response, and a number of the submissions has been, oh, that's a really good point and it's a bit difficult to deal with now. Can we just kick the can down the road and work on it in the implementation plan?
Okay, any questions in terms of PDAs and implementation plan? Perhaps, Rob, just if I can make a comment. I see the implementation plan is essentially where the rubber hits the road. The strategy part's the easy part. So it's actually achieving that implementation, and how you do that where appropriate in a joined up manner. And there will be some real challenges in all of that, and they're together with the alignment or otherwise of LTPs and other funding documents, whether they're related to NLTF's directions and GPSs or whatever. So it's, in my view, a really significant plan that will really, to be frank, focus the partners in terms of implementing what's been agreed through the strategy, and in particular the FDS.
Right.
No questions? Next one.
Okay, next one. So as part of our recommendations, you'll see we've referred to these ideas of concept plans or studies. So at the moment, I'm calling them spatial concept plans. We are still working up with your staff what the terms of reference for those pieces of work would look like and how we resource them, which again, I would expect to have completed probably by September in terms of the detail of what we're procuring. In the strategy, we referred to South Hamilton, North Waipaha. So that's your airport, Southern Link, so Halpo kind of area, and looking at that in an integrated way. So you're going to hear a bit about the great work that the Hamilton City team are doing with the emerging areas and with the SO1 developers. Well, we need to extend that out to think about the airport as a potential employment node, the demands around our Halpo, and have an integrated approach to how we deal with that area. And likewise, South Waikato District, North Hamilton area, same kind of pressures to Ko-Fi East, some of the retirement home propositions out at Gordonton, the Ngārawahia structure plan, which Waikato District is progressing, and how we integrate that better with what's happening in Te Rapa. There's a bunch of joined up thinking to be done in that space. And then we talked about the Hamilton to Tauranga corridor, and we had meant to talk about the North Waikato connections into Auckland piece as well. So that's the 4 pieces of work that I think are the core of our implementation plan for the strategy. And we actually already have budget to pay for from unspent budget from previous years in FPIC. So the idea is that those concept plans or those studies will provide the really big strategic framework, which would strategic information, which would go into our next future development strategy. You'll see I've put 2026 as the date for the next future development strategy. So we have, as staff are recommending, we try to get ahead of the LTP process this time around, but it does mean we only have a 2-year turnaround before we go through this drama all over again. Given that 3-year review and adjust cycle in the NPSUD, that's the hamster wheel we're on. But at least it gives our development community some certainty that there will be action in response to their demand. And I think I've covered those other bits. Oh, just a quick reference to the fast track approvals consenting process. Our thinking is that we'll have certainty by the time we actually start working on these concept plans about what projects have made it through that first tranche of fast track consenting underway. And so we'll have to pivot a little bit to deal with what the outcome of that process is, whatever it is. So we know that a number of the developers that you heard from received invitations to submit projects. We can be pretty safe in assuming that they have submitted projects for fast track consideration, but we can't predetermine the outcome of that process.
Okay. Any questions on concept plans? No. We'll move on to strategic boundary agreements. Chris, Donna and David.
Just lead off. Thanks. And Donna and David, just jump in when you feel like it. So there are 2 SBAs around Hamilton, one with Waikato, one with Waipa. And the one with Waikato has been given partial effect to already. And there are some areas subject to the SBA that are still in Waikato, HT1, R2, and little old WA down the bottom left there. And Lyndall, next slide. And with Waipa, there's SL1, which potentially takes the boundary of Hamilton out to the SL1 designation, which is the blue line that there that Lyndall's got a cursor on that Mark was talking to. Mark to my right was talking to earlier. Essentially, the strategic boundary agreement sets up a measured and careful process for the examination of the possible incorporation of these areas into the Hamilton City Council territorial boundary. Recognises that Hamilton is probably the most constrained territorial authority in the country, and certainly in Waikato, and looks out to ensure that the long-term planning of Hamilton and the wider metro area is done in a strategic way. I don't know whether Donna and David want to add anything to that.
No, I think Chris has covered that off well.
Yeah, I think just on the Southern Links designation, Chris, one of the things the agreement provides for is staged release over time. So it's not a case of it all has to go at once, and it is determined really by Hamilton City and its growth requirements. As Chris said, Hamilton City doesn't really have any hinterland to grow into other than into Waikato and Waipa districts. So we're kind of married together on this. Yep.
Questions? The team? No? Oh,
Sort of.
sorry.
No, you're right.
No lights come up.
No, I know it's difficult. Yeah, sort of coming back to a few of David's points earlier, and just thinking to the review of local government boundaries, boundaryless planning, merging of councils, etc. Yeah, just wondering if there's any thought being given to that as well. I suppose that is a mayoral forum topic. But yeah, it seems like there's a lot of issues that could be solved by by reading the review of local government and maybe taking on some of their recommendations.
I was just checking in terms of the consideration by staff, so that's been
I don't think we've used
out
the A
one
word.
probably
Future proof is about boundaryless
Yeah.
planning. It's the mechanism we use.
I'm happy to respond. I guess, look, around our table, no, we're not having discussions at Waipa in that space at this point. And I think I agree with you. It's probably a mayoral forum, probably debate or question. Perhaps, you could suggest it goes on the agenda.
Okay, if there's nothing further, move to affordable housing. David and Chris.
Who wants to go first? Chris?
Happy for you to lead off, David.
Well, I can say we have a plan change, which it's not progressing particularly rapidly, which was, it's really centered on housing affordability, the issue that the entire country is grappling with, how to address it. And one of the tools that has come up through the Queenstown area, the Lakes District Council has been looking at a provision called inclusionary zoning, which compels all housing developers of a certain size to set aside provision for more affordable housing as a component of their development. So we, under Tony Quickfall's kind of drive, initiated a plan change which saw that as a kind of central spoke to addressing housing affordability in Waipa. Tony Quickfall since moved on to Otorohanga District Council, beg your pardon, and there's been a refocus in terms of the affordable housing plan change to not just be focused on inclusionary zoning, but to regard it as a tool in the toolbox. And that is where it's kind of got to at this stage. The next stage will be probably talking to stakeholders across the board and mana whenua partners regarding progressing that. When we get to look at the number of plan changes each council's currently got underway, you'll see Waipa's got a huge list, and it's also got a plan change to address housing intensification, papakainga. So it's not the only thing underway currently looking at housing in Waipa. Chris?
Yeah, I'd reiterate that that last point of David's. Hamilton City Council similarly has a large number of plan changes at the moment, all competing for space, and the affordable housing is one of them that we are looking at, but it is taking its place in the queue, but it is being worked on.
Okay. Questions from anyone? No? Okay, no. Thanks, guys. Go to infrastructure funding. Nicola, you're on my list here.
So this is just to highlight that the strategy does include infrastructure. And so in the core part of the strategy, we've got what we see are the critical enablers to enable housing and business land. And then Part E in the appendix, we have a fuller list of projects. So, that's largely in response to the fact that the NPSUD requires us to identify infrastructure to support development. I think the thing we wanted to highlight here, and I don't think it will be news to anybody here, but that a number of those projects are currently unfunded, and also that their timing's uncertain. So that, it just means that, unless there's more funding tools or other solutions brought on, that we'll struggle to deliver what's already identified in the strategy. Next slide, Lyndall. And so just in terms of those out of sequence and unanticipated development submissions that we've received, we just have to think about that in that context of the infrastructure required, and certain things like, does it connect to existing networks? Is it self-sufficient? And also questions around the certainty. So while certain submitters might have promised things, we don't have any guarantees that will happen. And then there's also the big issue of ongoing maintenance costs, and then just opportunity costs as well for existing work programs. And then the main point there as well is that we can't include areas in our settlement pattern in the FDS if they're not supported by infrastructure.
Okay, questions? Just in that last point, Nicola, supported by identified infrastructure, what does the support word mean? Is that identified in an LTP or some other arrangement?
Yeah, so it would need to be in the LTP. I think in that 10 to 30 year window though, if it's in a 30-year infrastructure strategy, that's enough.
Okay, no, thank you. You're frowning, David.
Well, just picking up on your question. So that being the case, if you have to put it in an LTP, that means you've got to make financial provision for it. Do we have any sense of what the real cost is of stranded infrastructure, so to speak? So you make provision and then everyone goes, yeah, nah, market's not quite there because there's shitloads of land. We don't really. Meanwhile, district council, regional council, city council is sitting on presumably quite a lot of debt, having made provision. Do we have a sense of the cost of that and the implications, for example, of freeing up lots of infrastructure-enabled land that's not going to be uptaken?
Might see if somebody like Mark
Thanks.
might want to.
Nicola, thanks.
Sorry.
It's a very good question. I think the simple answer is simply if there isn't demand, then that investment wouldn't take place and it would be pushed out either through a long-term plan in 3 years or through an annual plan cycle. We wouldn't be investing more money after sort of, more bad money after bad money sort of thing. But, in a Hamilton context, for example, the Puketi wastewater treatment plant upgrades and everything are in our LTP, as is the Southern Wastewater Treatment Plant. So they are programmed in, and they will be featuring in our development contributions sort of capital work schedule. So sort of linked to that is this sort of circular argument that if it's not in your LTP, you're not collecting development contributions for it. And if you're not collecting DCs for it, you're burdening future development with a higher cost because you're spreading the cost over a lesser number of units of demand. So the sooner you have this in your LTP, even if it gets pushed out, the sooner you can start collecting development contributions for it, which I'm sure you're well aware of, but others might not be.
Just following on the same theme, but potentially there could be a whole lot of infrastructure at X amount that a council may not be able to put the total in because it might be then infringing its debt limits. So it's going to be an interesting management exercise of that whole process. And I wonder, just thinking aloud, whether some of that needs to be made clear in the FDS as one of the challenges for implementation. Mark?
Yeah, just sort of, yeah, thanks, Bill. You obviously make assumptions when you put these numbers into the long-term plan. So at the moment, I think the Southern Wastewater Treatment Plant's budgeted for circa 80 million in our long-term plan. Puketi's sitting around 400 to 500, about a million rather. Now, with, for example, at the moment, in terms of our draft LTP, it's assumed that we pay for all that cost, right? Now, real world practical reality is that no, we'd be looking to sheet some of that cost home to other developers, possibly outside of Hamilton City's jurisdictional control, who would be wanting to plug into that infrastructure as and when it's operational. So that 80 million for the Southern Wastewater Treatment Plant probably isn't 80 million if you've got developers such as the airport who are wanting to connect to it. So that's another way of, it depends how you account for it effectively.
Other questions? Don't appear to be any. Okay, thank you. So we'll move now to the fast track theme. Hannah, I understand you are presenting on this.
Oh, kia ora tātou. I know Robert already touched on this briefly before, but I was just going to provide a little bit more detail on.
Just need to speak closer
A little
to
bit
you.
closer
Thank you.
Just wanted to provide a little bit more detail on the fast track approvals process, given that that's in the public sphere at the moment, and there is some potential, I suppose, for crossover if any of the out of sequence development proposals from submissions in this strategy are progressed through the fast track approvals process. So the fast track approvals bill was introduced in March. Submissions closed just under 2 weeks ago. It's been a key priority of the new government, and it's expected to go through a fairly fast select committee process. Under the bill, projects of national or regional significance can apply to go through a simplified or faster consenting and approvals process, which is similar to previous fast track consenting processes, with the key difference being the shift in decision-making powers from an expert panel to government ministers. Ultimately, what this sort of means is that the approvals process for the whole project is taken out of the hands of the local government regulatory authority who would normally deal with it, and that's moved to ministers. So like Robert mentioned earlier, recently governments called for applications or expressions of interest for fast track projects. And we're aware of specific stakeholders and organisations who were specifically invited to put forward projects, a number of which are within the Waikato region. However, these applications don't close until Friday this week. So timing's a little bit touch with this, after which they'll be considered by independent fast track advisory group, which Mark Davey is a part of. So at this stage, we don't have certainty on which projects may be approved for fast track or even full clarity on those which have been applied for. Given this, we're recommending that fast track not be taken into great consideration during this deliberations process, particularly in terms of those out of sequence development proposals. And like Robert said, the sort of work done through the implementation plan can hopefully be informed by that first lot of decisions on fast track approvals, so we can incorporate it into our planning at that point. Sort of all I had to say.
Okay, no, thanks, Hannah. Any questions on that? No? No? Thank you. So we'll now move to retirement living. Katrina.
Kia ora koutou. So the purpose of this part of the presentation is just to provide a bit of context around planning for retirement living, given that there were a few submissions on this topic. Just to note, this is based on an initial desktop review of information, and it is something that will need further research and work to better understand the issue and potential strategic solutions for the sub-region. So the populations of the Waikato region and the future-proof sub-region are ageing. This will both increase the number of people aged 65 and over and change the composition of the population in the future. The graphs on this slide are for the Waikato region overall, and they're not ordered by increasing age, so they do need to be read carefully. But if you go to the next slide, please, Lyndall. These graphs show the age profiles for the 4 territorial authorities from the 2018 census data. So you can see that in the Waikato, Waipa and Matamata Piako districts, there was a large number of people in the approximately 45 to 64 age bracket in 2018. Hamilton is a little bit different and has a younger population than the other territorial authorities. Specifically when thinking about retirement village proposals, it's also just worth noting that while we often talk about the number of people reaching the retirement age of 65, the current average age of people going into retirement villages is mid to late 70s. Next slide, please, Lyndall. An ageing population will require consideration of how people's needs can be supported across different life stages and into older age, including their housing needs. However, this isn't straightforward. People do have diverse preferences around housing as they age. Some wish to stay within their current communities, others want to move closer to whānau, and others prefer to move to a retirement village or another location that offers security or a particular type of lifestyle. Research has shown, though, that there is a strong desire among older people to stay in their existing homes, or at least within their existing community. Our populations in New Zealand are also becoming more diverse over time, including different ethnicities and family structures. This means that people who make up the older population may have increasingly different aspirations and needs as they age. Housing choices, whether they're in the owner-occupier or the rental market, are not just a matter of taste or preference. 2 other key factors that influence choices are the costs of houses and retirement units, particularly given that older people in New Zealand typically have lower incomes and limited access to credit, and the accessibility, so the design and configuration of houses, which often limits older people's choices. Research has shown that older people want accessible and smaller homes. However, new builds that are designed with young families in mind may not be suitable for this. Next slide, please. Changes in the structure of housing markets and tenure may also have an increasing impact on housing choices for the older population. In the past, the assumption in New Zealand has generally been that when retirees will be able to sell their family home and then use the equity to cover the cost of entry to a retirement village. However, while older people are currently more likely than any other age group to own their own home, this is dropping. And for older people who do own their home, the number still with mortgages when they reach retirement is increasing. Retirement villages often have a high capital requirement for entry, and they also have ongoing costs, which can make them an unaffordable housing solution for part of the population. This is particularly the case for the more luxury type retirement villages. So for example, there's 3 options available at the Tamahiri Country Club this year being advertised, and they range between $1.05 and $1.6 million. So given all of this context, planning for retirement living as the sub-region's population ages will require a variety of solutions, considering older people's housing preferences and the different social, cultural and economic factors that affect housing choice. Retirement housing also needs to be considered in conjunction with other aspects like transport options and proximity to the services that people need. So ultimately, we just want to highlight that this is a complex issue and that further research and engagement with the retirement sector will be needed to better understand the demand and potential solutions for the sub-region. And as Robert mentioned earlier, that is identified as an action for the implementation plan. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Katrina. Questions? Don't appear to be any. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So the last topic in open, and before we break for lunch, plan changes. So Chris, Donna, David, and Nathan. You're kicking off, Chris.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, since I'm on the left-hand column there, I'll kick off. So I'll just run through them. I think the key point here is just to identify the two key plan changes for us at the moment. That's plan changes 12 and 14. Plan change 12 is a very large and consuming plan change, looking at the revised allocation of density. And plan change 14 is looking at flood hazards, partly in response to Cyclone Gabrielle, looking at ways of how the district plan and zoning and ultimately built form can better respond and perhaps mitigate against flood hazard. Just also note in terms of plan change 15 to Marta, the proponent there, TGH, they've requested that be put on hold at the moment. So that's on hold. And plan change 9 heritage, that's working through well. And I've talked to the inclusionary zoning plan change 16, but that is, as I mentioned before, taking its place in the queue behind those two other plan changes, 12 and 14, which are consuming quite a chunk of resources at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. David, next column.
Thanks, Bill. You, as mentioned before, a long list for WAPA, and just to summarise, they're broken into ones addressing industrial growth and other ones addressing housing. And so C10 is a growth cell, so it's simply wanting to advance an identified growth cell. So it's not a kind of out there proposal. Hautapu is simply expanding the existing Hautapu industrial area. Similarly, airport is expanding the existing airport industrial area, no surprise. And then the next three, Papakainga, inclusionary and residential, are all council plan changes to better address both the range of housing we provide for and the issue mentioned earlier about affordability. And then the ones following, C5 is a similar, advancing a growth cell, residential. Plan change 29, Tiamutu, is a private plan change wanting out of sequence, out of growth cell, and not supported. He's submitted to future proof. Private plan change T4 is an existing growth cell, Tiamutu, no problem. Private plan change Airport Road, I presume that's Tabby Tiger, is it? Anyway, we'll see where that goes. Plan change is an existing growth cell, Ahapa, and Inley Hotel is a resource consent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just on the Henley Hotel one, that is for another retirement living complex.
Yeah, sorry, didn't
in the
mention.
rural area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's why it's included.
Okay, no, thank you. Donna.
The benefit of having a proposed district plan, so don't have as many plan changes on the books. So we've got 66 appeals that we're working through as part of our appeals negotiations. Some of those already have been resolved with consent orders getting released as we progress. So we have made substantial progress, doing really well, and that's the top priority for the resource planning team at the moment.
And then we've got variation 3, which is our enabling housing supply for the medium density residential standards. So we've received our recommendations back from the hearings panel, and council are looking to notify a decision by the 28th of June on that.
Okay, thank you. Nathan.
So we've just, we've identified 2 private plan changes. So we've got Calcutta and Avenue Business Park. Both are industrial plan changes, rezoning of rural land to industrial land. Calcutta is 40 hectares on the eastern outskirts of Matamata, and Avenue Business Park is 14 hectares on the western outskirts of Orangeville. So the Avenue Business Park joins existing industrial zone. Calcutta is sort of out on its own a little bit. In terms of progress, we have a decision for Avenue Business Park, but we haven't released it as yet. We just received it yesterday. And Calcutta is, we have currently received a request from the requestor to ask for an extension from the minister. That has come a cropper with the MPS for HBL. So yeah.
Thank you. So any questions of the team in those plan changes? Sarah.
Just one, thanks, Chair, and that was Donna. In terms of the inclusionary zoning, I understand Waikato District Council was actively considering inclusionary zoning and the idea was that I guess councils would, when ready, put together like a joint plan change or at least do it simultaneously. What's the intention at the moment?
So that's not something we're actively pursuing. So we have our housing strategy that council has recently worked on, but we haven't made any decision on what we might do with regards to inclusionary zoning.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So it's not on the cards at the moment.
Questions? Don't appear to be. Okay. So just as a final roundup, are there any questions all now in terms of what's been presented this morning? Okay, so what I want to do, if I take you to page 14 on the agenda, and there's a report talking about the process, etc. And there is a recommendation to receive that report. So it's not making any decision, it's just receiving that report on the process regarding deliberations.
Happy to move.
Thanks, Angela. I have a seconder. Thanks, Liz. Discussion on that? Carried. And then on page 16, there's a further report in terms of the background and context, and that's really what we have been hearing on this morning. And again, it highlights those all of those matters that the team have presented on. And again, there's a recommendation on page 16 to receive that background and context. Okay, and seconded by David. Questions? I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So that brings us to, at this point, to the completion of the open agenda. What I'd like to do is to get a mover and seconder to go into public excluded, to do that now, and then we'll adjourn for lunch and then come back and consider those matters that are the PX part of the agenda. And those resolutions are on page 34. Thanks, Carolyn. Seconder for that, Anaya. Any discussion on that? I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So, and just a follow-up, in your inbox,